Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and the next build I've decided to tackle is the Rolling Magma Deadeye. By the end of last league, I did a spell slinger that involved sort of a Deadeye, or a Magma Orb setup, Rolling Magma setup, and it made me think that I haven't looked at this skill in quite a while, and I would definitely like to do a self-cast version. And this time around, I did kind of look at my previous Ice Spear Deadeye and thought that could also be applied to some Magma, Rolling Magma these days, especially with the triple damage staff and with Sire of Shards. So that's basically the concept and the attempt of the build I'm trying to pull off here, and it's worked out pretty well. It's been a lot of fun doing Rolling Magma with stacking as many chains as possible. In this case, I think I've got one from the Helm, 3 or 4 additional from level 21 gem, and then one from the Deadeye itself, Ascendancy, and it causes quite a lot of chains. And if you use the Threshold Jewel, that means that to begin with you have 50% less damage, but each additional chain is going to add 40% more damage. So after like 3 or 4 chains, you are starting to do some serious business damage. And with Sire of Shards, that means that your Rolling Magma or whatever projectile skill you use will spread out in a nova around you. But I've also got a quick weapon swap for single target damage on the Annihilating Light triple damage staff. I do think the weapon swap technology is still somewhat underused, but it's also not very comfortable to use in too many situations, and so far the staff situations have seemed the best for me. And in this case, Sire of Shards being my pure clear setup, letting me just shit projectiles all over the screen, and you can go even harder if you want with more proj speed. I've basically got none, this is just default. And then swapping into a triple damage staff with slower proj, meaning you are immediately in your single target setup, since slower proj helps facilitate more of your Rolling Magma overlaps, thus multiplying your damage several times compared to what it would normally be. When you use slower proj, it just really slows down the bounces of the Rolling Magmas, and technically, yep, if you've seen the sort of real cheating style technology going out there of negative proj speed, essentially, thanks to the negative downside on mirrored amulets at the moment, you could probably do that with Rolling Magma as well and just have all of your balls stack up essentially on one spot. I am not doing that. This is just a default with slower proj, and it's still good enough. It just means that positioning does get a bit awkward from time to time, and I do consider that negative proj speed tech basically cheating. If it's going to take you from, a skill that does a couple 100% worth of damage to 8,000% or some shit, then what's the point? What's going to compete with that? Anyway, yeah, so Rolling Magma seems pretty good though as a self-cast. As a Deadeye, it's been quite a challenge to path out the passive tree, especially factoring in all kinds of staff nodes and all that. So it's been quite a difficult build to put together, but it hasn't been too expensive. Only chucked in a few divines at this thing. I didn't have that much money to start with to spend on this, but I've still got half my money left over, which means that to put it together, to get it to a successful enough level, it's been pretty clean. And as soon as things start to get a bit tougher, we just swap into our single target setup and then go a bit slower and hit way harder. And I've done some very serious business tier 16s. I just then had a Harbinger memory that got fairly freaking intense, but thanks to the single target swap and then just chaining the slower proj balls all over the screen, you can kind of just run around a bit safer and kill everything all at the same time. Because the build itself doesn't have too much defense, just a bunch of evasion and then some life, and we move around kind of fast, but that's all it takes, I suppose. Since this does clear pretty damn fast and has been slaughtering bosses quite nicely thus far. And then of course, if you find yourself an echoing shrine, you can turn yourself into essentially a fountain, a Rolling Magma fountain, and it gets pretty hilarious. It's still been a bit of a challenge to fix my Eldritch Battery mana, because I've got a fair amount of Eldritch Battery energy shield, but once we get to the really high cast speeds, mana or energy shield just goes straight down the drain. And I'm also using a fireball attached to Arcanist brand to help proc Scorch, and I'll go over that in the actual little guide character setup in just a sec. But yeah, Rolling Magma, definitely a skill that is fairly underutilized, fairly underseen, and not really meta at all. And you don't even have to go Sire Shards. If you just did a regular sort of setup with 2 different staves with GMP and then one with slow proj, I think that'd be just as good. The Sire Shards is kind of a meme. It's only really good for open maps and if you've got an overkill of damage. Otherwise, it kind of feels like it's letting you down a lot of the time. So by all means, don't feel like you have to do it that way. You can instead just do 2 triple damage staffs, 5 link both of them, and it's extremely budget in that sense. So with that said, let me show you real quick how I put this character together. There's the character level 89 at the moment, more chains than bitrate, and that was of course alluding to the Sire Shards and the amount of projectiles we'd have with the restreamability of it being a bit low when a lot of stuff is going on. It hasn't seemed as bad though, honestly. The Magma orb itself is pretty small impact and also like not very high pixel density, quality, texture, one of those words. But the Herald of Ash they've been using that everyone's asking about does cause a bit of a mess, and that's a Despair Herald of Ash effect. It essentially looks like a big fireworks explosion, and it does add for a nice effect when you're like just destroying the entire screen with it. So Despair Herald of Ash, and essentially like any different Herald of Ash attached to this build or skill will just make the build feel and look quite a bit different. So, you know, up to you guys. So what we've got is Sire Shards. That was essentially the entire build idea, to go with Rolling Magma, Sire Shards, and lots of chains. And I can safely say that after playing this up to level 89, which is still not too high, it's been 18 hours or some shit, you really don't need Sire Shards. It's only particularly potent on very outdoor maps, and other than that, it might sometimes feel like a bit of a detriment because it does reduce your damage. You don't get as good overlaps. Sometimes you have to position correctly to hit something like right over there. So you're just missing some things. I'm going to start using Pinpoint soon, which will add a few extra projectiles, but then once it ramps up Intensify, it removes an extra one. So not sure if that's going to solve anything, but it's going to be something. And then on the weapon swap, I'm using Annihilating Light, 60 reduced LE res, and it's just a 5 link. And with a 5 link, it's got something like 5 or 6 million DPS, and that's with just like one ball hitting. But the way that Rolling Magma works is if you do use slow proj and you do have a big enough target, you can potentially hit multiple times with your ball bounces as they overlap. So in theory, if you've got like 7 chains, or 7 bounces rather, then you might be able to hit 7 times. In practice, that's never going to happen, but at least a few of them overlapping is totally doable. And if you do use like a reduced proj speed amulet, and if you haven't seen those, basically you have to use Benchcraft to reduce proj speed, or Veiled reduce proj speed, and then mirror it and get the negative downside. If you're using one of those, I haven't tested it, I imagine you could probably stack up a shitload of magma orbs right next to yourself and just kind of point blank a boss down really quickly. Maybe I'll test it at some point, but like I said, feels like it's going to be a bit cheating level, and if you want to take your Rolling Magma to the next level, maybe you can do that instead. So it's just a 5 link at the moment, and we swap it in just because it has slower proj, so it immediately becomes a single target setup. Otherwise, as I said, I think you can just do 2 Annihilating Light setups if you really don't like the look of Sire Shards, and it'll be a bit cheaper and probably a bit nicer for clear on most different map tile sets, because Sire Shards is only really good on the super spread out AoE, something like a Dunes or a Canyon. And the current links that I've got attached here aren't really optimal, but Rolling Magma, level 21. At level 21, it gains an additional chain, so that is pretty important to get a level 20 to a 21. We then have Crit Strikes, Echo, Crit Damage, Fire Pen, and Added Cold. The Added Cold has been there since leveling, but I've actually kind of liked it for my clear setup because it helps freeze and shatter things, whereas otherwise you wouldn't have any of that in the build. And in the 5 link single target setup at the moment, we have Rolling Magma, Pinpoint, Crit Strikes, slow proj, and fire pen. My 6th link is either going to be intensify or spell echo, and maybe I justify getting rid of crit strikes as well, not quite sure yet, but this is a tough build to fill a lot of crit out in, so I kind of have to use the crit strikes at the moment. Since the passive tree, as you can imagine, similar to the Ice Spear, but as a Deadeye, as a Ranger, you start and you essentially get nothing happening for a long time, and that does mean you generate quite a bit of extra waste in your passive tree. We then just pick up some crit nodes. We have to take this Mastery for Intensify, +1 Intensify. Eldritch Battery helps solve our mana, and then we can spam away just based off of Energy Shield. We then have some Staff nodes, some Fire nodes, and some Life nodes and all that. And currently I am running a threshold for Rolling Magma. As I said, to begin with, that means you have 50% less damage on your Rolling Magma, but more damage per chain. So if you stack your chains and try and do some, positioning to make sure that your last few balls are the ones that are hitting the enemy, then they should deal way more damage than they otherwise would if you're just hitting with the first few. But it does create more positioning issues, and currently I'm also trying to do a Arcanist brand Fireball with Runebinder, which means I can't use a decoy totem, and I really want a decoy totem, so I might still get rid of Runebinder, but the entire purpose behind this is to have another skill that scales similar with proj damage and fire, and that is Fireball. It hits very hard as well. It then has Arcanist brand, so it's going to utilize my secondary 5 or 6 link, and the point there is for it to hit a bit harder and also to use this jewel for Fireball, which means it can scorch, and that means that a lot of the time I'm applying a 30% lower res debuff on the enemy through a scorch, but it also does seem to hit pretty damn hard at the moment, even on a 5 link without super good supports. And it helps maintain that I don't have to be perfectly positioned with my Rolling Magma slow approach. So especially for some of those essences you may have seen during the video, we put down some Arcanist brands, and then those fireballs are just going to be chunking the enemies while I'm running around trying to position perfectly, and it helps, I think, in that sense. It does chunk away at the mana though a good bit, so we have to make sure we're fixing our energy shield, and that's why I've also taken this little leech node. I only just took it, so I'm not 100% sure it's helping too much, but there are ways to fix mana if I really need to. For now, it's been just a light issue and not something I'm too concerned about. So Annihilating Light, Sire Shards, Rolling Magma. We've then got an extra chain on the hat and just rolled it to do life, energy shield, and resists. Rolled a belt just for life and resists. We do need a lot of resists for Annihilating Light. So as you can see, I am capped with Annihilating Light, just barely on my resists. But if we swap over to our Sire Shards without the Annihilating Light, that's the kind of resist that it takes to get capped. You basically need 200 to all over capped, and it is a bit of a challenge. So most of my gear is just resist based. I got some temple gloves with fire exposure, some resists. We got boots that I crafted, just have resists. And then the really interesting shit is these days with the mirrored stuff, you can get some serious cast speed. So my build has barely any cast speed, but I'm fixing that entirely through the League mechanic jewelry. So I picked this thing up for, I don't know, like all my jewelry that I picked up was, you got to look around and try and balance perfectly for your build, but it was pretty fucking cheap. So 37 cast speed, a bunch of life, a little bit of lightning res, I can't remember what it was, like 20C or some shit. We then got this guy. This one I actually had to pay a little bit more for, 120C, because it basically doesn't have any real downsides. So bit of energy shield, fix the rest of my fire res, since that was the last thing I needed to balance, and then 43 cast speed. And you can imagine how actually powerful something like this is. On a ring, 43 cast speed. An entire passive tree for a caster rarely gets this much cast speed, and you're getting it all in one suffix slot. So yes, I'm sacrificing some other shit on that ring, but ultimately, like, it's worth 10 passives or some shit on your tree if you're just speccing to pure cast speed. And then I just picked up an amulet that did some things, because getting a real big cast speed amulet or some real doubles through the mirrored system is actually pretty difficult. Amulets are expensive on the high end. So this one, I don't know, wasn't worth much, like 30C or some shit. And just has +1 fire, a little bit of cast speed, and some crit multi. Thanks to all the mirrored amulets, I think regular amulets are kind of low on the price scale at the moment, except for ones that people are going to try and mirror to get doubles. And yeah, who knows? There'll still be some really nutty gear out there. And then also a chest I just rolled so that it would have some energy shield, and then on top of that, some spell crit. So I grabbed a hunter chest, I went to my harvest station, and just spammed it with caster reroll. So 75 per caster reroll, and every single one is going to hit, if it's a hunter chest, either additional curse or spell crit. And I just went until I got something decent. I needed resists, I needed some life, and some energy shield. And I may even recraft that to energy shield instead of evasion at the moment. But yeah, it's pretty easy to make your harvest do some decent things. Yes, everyone's pissed about harvest and it's kind of nerfed and whatever, but it's still fairly powerful for certain things like caster reroll chests or curse on hit rings, that sort of thing. So other than that, passive tree doesn't really do too much. Nothing else to really say. We use Deadeye just for additional chain. The colliding terrain projectiles doesn't do anything for Magma Orb, so don't worry about that. 2 additional proj, which is pretty handy just for Syra Shards, for clear, and also for single target, because once we get down to the pinpoint level, with that 2 additional proj, I can still have an additional proj happening, and that does make actually hitting things quite a bit nicer. Then Gathering Winds for Tailwind, and Focal Point for effective marks, and in this case I'm currently using Sniper's Mark. It just gives increased damage to enemies, doesn't do anything other than that. But you can also use Assassin Mark, and that'll probably just about cap your crit if you'd rather do that. But currently my POB is telling me that like 60% increased damage against enemies for proj is the better choice, but you could do Assassin Mark instead, and it would also help you yield some power charges, because it is kind of tough to get crit in this build. So we're using a Diamond Flask with crit, using an Onslaught Flask with cast speed, running Purity of Elements, Grace, Herald of Ash, and it's a little tough to get good defenses and all that, but it's been a good playstyle so far. I don't die too often, and the DPS and the playstyle is pretty damn fun. I've still got a few things to figure out. I might try a lightning warp setup instead of a flame dash setup. I might go to a decoy totem, and then the last few levels are possibly getting a real jewel, because this is just a placeholder, getting some crit multi up here, maybe another life node, some shit like that. Still figuring some things out, but so far so good. That's the character. I'm hoping it takes on some of the Ubers that are available. I've yet to kill any Ubers this league because I was playing a couple of, experimental builds. This is a bit more range, a bit better DPS, and a bit more, how you say, Uber viable, maybe. It's not all about the defenses, not all about how hard you can take damage. It's sometimes about how hard you can hit and how well enough you can run away screaming like a girl. So that's currently the build. Hopefully good things for the end game video as well, but so far so good. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.